a recording in your inbox about an hour or two after the class. Next, I'd like to go through our training options. So I'm sure a lot of you attended the Ready API 101 on August 16th. Look out for promotion for future classes if you didn't attend. Then we have the next our free advanced training options, which you are in, currently you're in ServiceV Pro 301. We are only going to do, from moving forward, we are going to make the 201 90-minute class. So we're going to combine the classes, and if you attend all the classes, you will receive a graduate certificate at the end of all three. And then next we have our premium training, which is through Wise Clouds. It is offered on-site and on-demand, and after that you can get SmartBear Pro certified. So with me today in the studio is Ready API product owner Gail Schlansky and technical engineer Tamil Sanchez, and they will be running the technical content of the webinar, and I'll just be running logistics, and I am Alex Fusco in customer marketing. All right, do you guys want to go over the agenda?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Alex. So thanks everyone for attending. Tamil and I are very excited to have this opportunity to do some training. Last week we did the ServiceV 201 session. I can hear myself really loud. And we covered what we refer to as 3 use cases, and we talk about how you could use service virtualization for reducing external costs, removing dependencies between teams, and controlling API conditions. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more because we're going to do a recap. And then we talked about how for each of those use cases you would set up and create virtualized services for them. And we went through a bunch of samples and scenarios. Today, what we're going to do is go through some more advanced topics, and specifically we're going to talk about what Verts Server is and how you set it up and configure it and how you would use it and what you would do with it and all those great things. We also have a couple of advanced topics and tips and tricks, and we actually really encourage you to ask questions and direct us through this session so we can customize it to your particular needs. Obviously, we want you to get the most out of it, and that's probably the best way for us to satisfy your questions is just to have you ask them away. So please don't be hesitant.
Great. All right. Thank you. And now we're going to do a few polls. We have 2 questions for you.
The first question
is, what Ready API module do you yourself use currently? Select all of apply.
Yeah, so are you using SoapUI, NG Pro, Load, ServiceV, Secure? Are you using open source? We're curious to know what products you're using yourself. Not necessarily what's in the company, but what you're using. So please fill it out. And we're looking at the responses. A little more time, and let's get the rest of them. Come on, everybody. It's not a hard thing to vote.
We have a little bit over half of the people voted. There's a couple more to go.
We know you have it in you.
There we go. We got some.
Come on, a couple more responses. All right.
All right. All right, closing the poll. All
Just
right.
towards the end, we got close to the end, but.
All right, do you want to share?
Yeah, please share. So interesting. Actually, a lot of you guys are using open source, which is very interesting. I don't know. I couldn't tell like how many people use more than one product. So we have SOAP, which we expect to be the #1. Load, a number of people using Load, a number of people using ServiceV. We hope that as a result of this session, you're going to have even more people using ServiceV. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of it and see opportunities within your environment.
Great. All right. We have one more question. How will you use your virtualized APIs? Select all that apply.
So this really goes back to what we were talking about with the first, what we did, sort of the way we broke things up in the first session. And basically, we want to know: do you virtualize your APIs for testing, or because you're doing some prototyping and you want to have an early sample to test a concept? Or are you using them in a sandbox environment where you just need something that's safe to play against? Or do you have some external APIs, whether they're external to your company or external from your group, that you need to rely on and you need to have access to them? So we're always curious about what drives people to virtualize, and this is what that question goes at. So come on, please vote. Everybody should be voting. This is easy. What makes you interested in virtualizing any services, APIs or services? We also support JDBC, so from a database access perspective, you could virtualize it. And we find that our customers actually have lots of different reasons, and they use it in very different ways. Some of our customers come from SOAP UI, and they're doing testing, and they want to do virtualization. Some of our customers are building really interesting advanced applications, and they want to virtualize the systems that they have to connect to save money, to save time, to save resetting and stuff like that. So, all right, well, we got good percentage voting.
Yeah, let's close it, and then I'll show the results.
So for testing, which is not surprising since a lot of our customers come from the SOAP UI world, prototyping, number 2, and right below that is actually external dependencies, yay. Sandboxing, yep, and other. Oh, I want to know what other is. Need to follow up with that.
Awesome. All right. Now I'm going to make Tamil presenter.
All right, so we're going to start off today with a recap of last week's training class. We're going to really quickly using Widget to get started and how easy that is, and we're going to also create a virtual API by recording, and we'll show some of the dispatch strategies that we have available so that you can make your responses realistic and behave as close to what the real API would behave, get there as much as possible. By the way, we will be attentive to the questions tab. So if you have any particular questions or use cases that you guys would like to visit or talk about, feel free to let us know. All right, so you guys are familiar with Ready API. In order to actually use ServiceV, you need to jump onto the ServiceV tab. But we're going to talk about the wizards, right? We have a couple of different wizards that will get you from 0 to actually having a fully functional test for functional testing with the testing wizard. Or we have the same for security for load test. The Virtual API wizard allows you to build virtual APIs from your definitions, from recording traffic, or from starting with the RESTful resource manually. And that's how I will start today. So in this case, let's use just a get method that will look at localhost port 8085, assuming that's free, and we'll have something called get pets. Oh, obviously it needs to be an HTTP endpoint, so if we don't have that, give me 1 second, I need to refresh my...
Yeah, so just as a background, I mean, we created these tools that make it really easy for first-time users to get started, and we struggle with where to make it available for the users so they can get access to it quickly and easily. But we've seen customers and users get really excited by it because it does make it simple to get going. So those are those, create new functional tests, security tests, load test, or virtual API, and we don't like to refer to them as wizards because wizards have bad reputations, but in reality, it does make it really easy and quick to get going. So now Tamil will show you what's going on when he actually opens up that
Right, so I've
tool.
decided to actually use a Swagger definition instead. That way you'll get more resources that we can pick up from the actual definition file. So I use a very common SWIRE definition that's out there called the pet store, which basically provides information about posting, getting pets with pet ID, so on and so forth. And what you're seeing here is an actual client that will allow you to interact with your virtual API immediately. So right now, you could send all requests to your virtual API and get back the responses. I'm getting a couple of different error messages depending on what method I'm using, obviously because it would require some sort of parameter in order for it to work. But I'll show you in more detail with the SoapUI client itself. Okay, so right now it went through all the steps. We got these responses, but if we want to manipulate anything a little bit better, let's say with the post pet method, and let me delete the empty one. There's two responses because one is for 405 and the other one should be for a good response. Actually, this is a 405. I'll change it over to 200, okay? And I'll add a message in here that says successful. So these messages are usually picked up from not usually, they are picked up from the SWIRE definition, and if there isn't any hosted in there, obviously it will be empty. Sample response. And now I'm going to use SoapUI as my client to actually post to my local host and get back that response that I just manipulated. And some of the more advanced features will allow you to route and record and capture these responses in the instance that you want to get up and running much quicker. Let's see.
So what you just did now was you went to that file, create new, and you just said, I want to create a new project. This lets you really easily create the project.
Right, so I'm basically using SoapUI as my client to interact with my virtual API, and if everything goes along accordingly, I will hit that API and get back my sample response. So that's part of the initial process for creating virtual APIs. Again, this is just a quick recap. We did go over this last week. So a couple of other things. Dispatch strategies allow you to build things a little bit more realistically, right? So that you could have multiple responses and have the APIs, the virtual API respond just like the real service would. So in order for us to do that, let's actually go back to ServiceV. Let's add a couple of other responses to this initial API that I have, right? So the first one says, let's add pet and sample. Say this pet is going to be a SmartBear. Let's make it a little more realistic. SmartBear, let's add another response that will have something similar, maybe in a different format. So let's say pet, SmartBear. And then let's have a catch-all. And what I really want to show you right now is these dispatch strategies. This will allow you to create a behavior around how the virtual API dispatches of responses. And we have a couple of different options, but I'm going to use parameter because it's probably the most easiest to use, and again, it gets you up the quickest. So parameter will allow you to create rules against a query string, against a resource, against headers, and then dispatch a particular response depending on what these entities are that you built out. You can add multiple if you'd like, so you can add multiple criteria here in which to dispatch your responses. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to say if there's a query string named format, return the JSON response. If there's a query string format XML, return the XML response. And for everything else, I'll just add it to the catch-all, which is the error message that I have down here. That way we have realistic responses, right? So if I go back to my client, right, I'm using SoapUI as my client to interact with my virtual API. I can send out a request, and I will most likely get an error message, right? And here it is. And the reason for that being is because it's expecting a query string named format with the criteria of it being a JSON response or an XML response. So if I say XML, I will get my XML response, and if I say JSON, I should get my JSON response. So that basically allows you, as you can see, to create a realistic situation, so that if you're in the need of building an application over this API that's not available, you will be able to interact with it realistically and build your front-end behaviors. And that's just one example. Same goes for testing, for removing any other dependencies that you may have for designing, right, and building out tests. So definitely really helpful in those regards. So we're going to jump onto the scenario 2, and that's building out an API from a definition. We actually already did that. That's how I initiated. And let's talk a little bit about the behavior controls and then move over to a transaction log. So the behavior controls will allow you to select different type of behavior for your environments, right? It's very much the case that sometimes you want to build tests, let's say for a third-party API's response, which may react a little slower, may have some sort of, you may add some code for timing out the interaction with the third-party API, but you don't know how that code will actually behave unless you have something concrete to test against. So ServiceV does have the capability for you to add those environmental behavior restraints so that you can actually simulate that while not having to actually alter the real API. Okay, so behavior will allow you to do that not only within the server capacity side, where you can limit the amount of concurrent users that will access this virtual API, but also from the network standpoint, and we also can simulate different HTTP status codes. So to get started over here, let's go ahead and add a delay of 5 seconds for this for this API to respond back. Again, going back to my client, and let's change the parameter in here so we could get a different response. But once we execute this request, we'll see that it will take about 5 seconds for this to respond. And again, the importance here is that this third-party API that you have no control over may at some point not give you a response back in a timely manner, and you want to be prepared for that. And the best way to do that is actually to be able to simulate it via virtual service. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick pause here. I mean, we've talked about a lot. I want to see if there's any questions that's coming in, any particular use cases that you guys have seen in the past or that you have encountered, and where you may make use of any of these services that you've seen.
It's a very quiet audience today.
Yeah.
But I'm sure they'll get going. They'll just need a little wake-up time, that's all.
All right, the last thing that we want to show for the recap is the transaction log. Okay, transaction log basically will capture every single interaction that is made with your virtual API. That way, if you want to go back and see how the API was being leveraged, or if you have some sort of troubleshooting process that you want to go through and you want to see what were the requests and responses, all of these will be stored so that you can monitor them. All right, so let's go ahead and actually get into some of the newer stuff that we want to show you
scenario
today.
3. Oh.
All right, so we had one more recap.
Right. So this is when we want to control conditions, and honestly, the cool part, although you've touched on it already, is that if you want to control the API conditions for testing purposes or something like that, you want to check the limits, really large numbers, delays in the system, like you talked about. This is another reason why people want to virtualize, is that they can't necessarily recreate broken hardware or delays and things like that easily within the real API. So this is a good way to test it from a virtualized perspective by setting it up so that it does these things. So
right. So we've gone over some of these. The two very important ones that we didn't go over: using data to create dynamic responses and adding the Vert to testing strategy. So that's in the case of that you're in tester and you're trying to design tests for APIs that are not available. And as Ready API's nature, we do have multiple products so that you could actually accomplish these things. So let's go ahead and take a look at how you can actually build a testing strategy against a virtual instance. Go back to Ready API. And we obviously use SoapUI for this. Again, I've been using it as a front-end client to interact with the virtual service, but now let's go ahead and actually create a more advanced test. Okay, so for this very simple post method, I'll just add it to a test case. Okay, and once it's in a test case, it moves me over to SoapUI and gives me the capability of sequencing steps and doing a couple of other cool things that we have here. In my case, I'm going to add a data-driven capability to basically iterate through the different type of formats that I support, and that's XML and JSON, right? And then I'll even add a text over here, the text field, text. Okay, and then I'll remove these others that I will not use. So now that we have this capability, we can iterate through all those values and see the responses. But it's more important to also automatically check for expected results. So within SoapUI, we have the capability of adding assertions, which are basically rules that will automatically validate your API responses, so that you don't have to sit and actually look at it. It's also very helpful when you're automating and running this through your CI/CD pipelines. You will not have to go through all the responses after the tests are run. We will automatically report to you what has passed and what has failed. We have about 30 different types of assertion criteria, which will validate things from content to schema compliance and other standards. Again, we have over 30 of these, so definitely really, really helpful. Now, for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to say contains, and I want to say I'm looking for errors, nor case comparisons, and click OK. That way, I know I'm going to get an error message, but that's definitely my intent, so that you guys can see what that would look like. And this is done against my virtual API, right? So now I know the behavior of my testing flow. And the next steps is when the API is actually available, you can switch the endpoint to the actual real API, and that the test that you pre-built will apply to the real API. So really, really powerful. As you can see here, I have a failure just as I expected. Now I can go back into my transactions and just look at what I've iterated through, what my information that I sent was, what the information that I got back was, and you can also report on this and submit this as part of your continuous integration pipeline. So hopefully that makes sense, guys. Again, this is going against my virtual API, as you can see here, localhost port 8088. Once this is ready, I can actually point to the real pet store and apply the same type of tests.
Yeah, that's actually one of the huge values is that you can flip between the virtualized service and the real service, like just with a quick configuration here within the within the UI. And it's like not setting up a whole bunch of stuff behind the scenes, which is great. So, all right. So what we did was we covered a bunch of stuff around creating Verts, creating the virtualized services as virtualized services, leveraging virtualized services from within your testing scenarios, and then now we're going to talk about sharing these virtualized services, and that's where we get to the power of Verts Server. So the Verts Server is the server that allows you to share these services across other users and run tons of them and stuff like that. We're going to talk a little bit about how you should think about setting up your virtualization environment. What do you need to virtualize? What don't you need to virtualize? Something that we call Vert actions, and we use that a lot internally. And what it means. It's different from an action within an API. Some tips and tricks and anything that you guys send us for questions, which again is still pretty quiet. So let's start by talking about Verts Server. And ServiceV is really that graphical product that you use to point and click and create your Verts. So anybody can create virtualized services. We really kind of think of it as being the testers or the developers who would be creating virtualized services. But then there's and by the way, it's a desktop product. You download it as part of Ready API. You get ServiceV, and it's in there, and it's easy to use. It's a desktop product, very easy interface. But then when you create these verts, you don't want to have everybody have the expertise to creating these services. You actually want them to be available to lots and lots of people. And so we have something called the Verts Server, which is really for your other team members to be able to access those virtualized services and share them, use them, and it's also installed in a central location, and you can just push these virtualized services that you create on ServiceV. You can just push them out, actually right in the UI. It's a really clean interface. I love it. It's very slick. And the Verts Server has a web UI that allows you to manage it and see what's going on inside the Verts Server, and see what's happening from a logs perspective, how long Verts have been running, who's using the Verts, things like that. So it's a really great interface.
So we have a lot to show here, but to summarize, ServiceV is where you will design and build out your virtual APIs. Vert Server is where you will have these scale, right? You want multiple users to use them. You can very easily share them via Vert Server, and that's what we're going to see today. But Vert Server has a lot of use cases and a lot of power as well, right? It sounds like, from simple thought, if you think about what we just said, you create virtual APIs in ServiceV, and you just deploy them in Vert Server. But that's not the case. You can version them. You could have your own internal workflows that will allow you to use them more efficiently, right? That way they're not living and dying in one environment. They're living, and maybe other users can interact and add more to it, and make better use of it, duplicate it, branch them out into different services. And we see this happening more and more, especially with users implementing microservices within their organization. Now, Vert Server also, these are some of the things that we will show today. We will show you how you can share these virtual APIs really easily, how you can manage them via the web UI. We'll look at the Vert Server console itself within ServiceV, so you can get some of the details of how many users have been using it, how you can actually deploy them, how you can copy them back into your interfaces. And we'll go over some of the plugins that we have around it, so that we can add it as part of an integration or automated process that you may have internally.
Yeah, most of our customers are using automated systems, and so Maven and Jenkins is part of their normal language, and that's a great way to do it. Somebody asked a question of, do the users need to have a license? And the license is on the Vert Server. Any user can access the Vert Server. It's about how many virtualized services are running on the Vert Server is what the license is about. So it can be used by all users or any users.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at Vert Server, and we're going to start really high level for this one. Okay, so I'm actually going to go and navigate where you should go when you want to trial or download Vert Server when you have licenses, and that's obviously on our SmartBear website. So you go to smartbear.com/downloads, and this will just display all the different products that we can download. But I'm going to go into the API space, and you will, obviously we have multiple products within the API space, but you can download Vert Server from this location. And as you can see, we have distributions for Mac, Windows, and Linux, and some others extras in there, so definitely take a look at them. The installation process is pretty straightforward, very similar to any other product. Now, once you do install it, there is an initial process that you need to go through to start adding users, because Vert Server does require user login and so on and so forth, and that you will set up when you initialize it. Now, if you want to add users after you install it, right after you build the first one, there's some command line parameters that you can use to build out these users, and I will definitely go over that during this session as well.
There it goes.
So now it's finished. Now it's going to take me through the process of the actual first initiation phase, where it will ask me to start building out some users and do some of that fun stuff. And all of it will be initially from the command line. But then again, we'll also show the interface that Verts Server has to offer for managing your virtual APIs.
And so I kind of slow because we're installing it here, but that's the idea of the training, is to actually take you through the process from beginning to end, so you're not surprised.
All right, so this is takes a little bit to boot up, but once it does, again, it'll take us through that initiation process where we create a user, or we have to add a license, whether it's a trial or a full subscription license. You know, it's depends on what what process you're going through. And while this is occurring, let's go back to ServiceV just to show you. This would be the Vert Server console that ServiceV will apply. Now, obviously, it doesn't have anything behind the scenes because we're installing it now. So right now it's asking me, please enter an absolute path for a license or key. I'm actually going to paste that in here. Paste. Enter. Do you want to activate the license? The answer is yes. You have to have full access to the internet connection. There is an offline way. If you don't have access to the external services, there is a way that you can go through. So that
use licenses, right?
We'll send you a key, and you should be able to apply it.
We have offline activation for our licenses as well as online activation. It's actually a larger percentage than you'd expect that have offline activation. It's pretty popular.
So this is definitely the process. Again, it's just setting up your actual profiles within, and as you can see, mine allows me 2 concurrent verts to run, and that's basically it. Now I'm in the background. If you guys notice, it's now actually reading Verts Server, so it's saying wait a moment while the data is being received. And I had previously had virtual APIs already deployed, so if this populates correctly, we should have you should be able to see some of the things that I had pre-deployed onto this canvas. All right, guys, so really quickly, while this is finishing up, does anybody have any questions about any use cases or anything else, maybe something that you've seen along these ways that you can make use of, or any comments that you guys have against Verts Server and ServiceV? All right, nothing coming in. Again, this is still populating. While that's going on, why don't we go into the actual command line and show you some of the parameters that we have when it comes to actually, manipulating the users and a couple of other things that you can do with Verts Server. So let's say SmartBear, and then Ready API. Let's see which ones are in there. I should have a Ready API Verts Server. Or maybe it's just Verts Server. Verts. There we go. As you can see, I have a bunch of different versions in here.
Most current.
So right now I could say Verts Server .bat and then use something like a -u parameter for looking at the users that are available there. Let's see. Let's try -u. So those are the users that are available on my Vert server. As you can see, I have a webinar version. I have a Tamil 24. Tamil. If I want to add a user, I think there's a -a parameter, and then I can say Tamil 30, create a brand new one, and it should ask me to build a password.
There you go.
And I'll say sample. So if you guys want to go in and try my sample, my virtual APIs, you should be able to. And that's all there is. Now when I go in here and say, now check for -u, I'll have that extra user. You could also delete users from your list. I don't remember, but I believe it's -d, and then select users. Let's say Tamil 30. I hope I'm right on that.
Blow up the system.
I assume it worked. So let's say you. And Tamil is no longer there. So as you can see, we do have some various parameters so that you can manipulate and use your users there. Now in the background, as you can see, Vert Server is actually running. And basically, right, you can see all the different virtual APIs that are deployed on there. If you want to deploy further APIs on Vert Server, it's a really simple process from this interface. All you really need to do is drag and drop your virtual APIs down. If you see an API that's interesting that you may make use of, that you may need in the future, or that you can add to, you can drag it and drop it upward, and it will be downloaded into your system and displayed on ServiceV. Okay, so definitely really powerful there. It's really easy to understand and manipulate. If you want to look at the transactions that are occurring against virtual APIs deployed on Vert Server, we have a transaction log that allows you to do that. Activity gives you information about who has accessed, who has deployed, who has virtualized these APIs, who has updated, and from where, right? You can see the client IPs that have been manipulating and deploying these virtual APIs. And last but not least, these metrics just gives you a high-level understanding of who, of the number of services that you have deployed, and how many requests and responses have been received in total.
So those are great. And that's how we started, was giving people access to information from within ServiceV. But what we found is that some people are actually managing their Vert servers as a server entity in the network. And so we added a new web UI that allows you to manage that Vert server in a much more robust way. Gives you lots more information, gives you audit logs and what's going on the server and things like that. So why don't we show them that tool?
Yeah. So if wherever Vert Server is installed, if you go into that domain and just port 9090 is a default, but that obviously can be changed with some configurations. But 9090 is a default. If you go into the domain port 9090 -Vert Server, you will get this nice little interface that is much easier to deal with than the command line.
Yeah, and just right on the top it tells you how many concurrently running virtualized services you're licensed for. So if you are licensed right now, there's none running, but he's got a license for 2. You can imagine that he might run out of that quickly, and so because he's got 27 of them deployed. So clearly he might start running multiple at the same time. In which case, what you're licensed for and versus what's running is very important.
That's right. And you guys didn't actually experience this because I was logged into these things, but I do have my user over here. Again, these are the users that I was creating and removing on the interface, and you can log into your specific users in order for you to manipulate that.
Right, and this is actually the users of the Vert server versus the users who are accessing the virtualized services. So these are the people who have the control and can do things on the Vert server versus the users that can just hit those virtualized services.
Right. So this gives you a level of access control against who's manipulating your virtual API and who updates them and who puts them on a particular ports and so on. But again, you can make it available to users to actually hit and take advantage of when it comes to running tests or developing front-end applications that will consume the future APIs or so on and so forth. And this Vert server interface, allows you to do a lot. You can manipulate the different types of ports. You could sign a random available port, which is, more, it's more in handy than you would think. You can't imagine how many times I go in here and I just say, okay, try port 8088, 8085. They're all in use, so I can't, I can just say, assign an available port. It'll look in my system of what's open, and it'll sign it. So really, really powerful. You can remove things in bulk. You could start virtual APIs in bulk. You can stop virtual API in bulk. And let's not forget the capability of reporting and seeing, how the APIs have been being used and so on and so forth. So definitely there's a lot in here. Hopefully you guys are taking away a lot from this session because it truly is a lot of information that's not initially visible to the end users.
So we had a couple questions come in, and the first one was how to connect to the server running on a different server machine. That's inherently, naturally what we do. Do you want to go through?
Right. So I can talk about that. So guys, remember when we said ServiceV allows you to design and build out virtual APIs? These APIs will only be accessible on that local machine, which means if you have a partner or a colleague that wants to use it, they can't hit it. That's what Verts Server is for. So within Verts Server, again, you'll install it in a centralized location. You will deploy that Verts that you want your colleagues to use by simply dragging and dropping it, and now they would be inherently available to everybody who has access to that particular server. Okay, so if you click on any of these Verts, you'll see the endpoint itself. You can provide the endpoint and port, and whoever needs to use that virtual API can hit it by using that endpoint and port. Hopefully that answers your question.
And then there was a question about being tied with AD, and unfortunately, there isn't any tie today with Active Directory for the users that are defined on the Vert server. However, you can imagine that there's not a lot of users on the Vert server. There's really an administrator of the Vert server and maybe one or two other designates, but it's not like a commonly accessed server. So consider it just a, it's for the person who's going to administer the Vert server. It's not for the users who are accessing the services that are running on the Vert server. So, it should be only a few people within any company that are actually accessing it.
Right, to piggyback off of that, guys, so remember, you have a couple of, maybe a team, 3, 4, 5 people, maybe more, designing these virtual APIs, and then everybody else, your testers and developers, your bigger team, they can just access these virtual APIs because they're available just like any real API. You just give them the endpoint and port, and maybe some sort of documentation as to what the API does, and that's all they really need. And on that note, talking about documentation, we do expose a Swagger specification once a virtual API is deployed. Hopefully I remember this correctly, and if I do, we'll be able to see it. If not, I'll have to get back to you guys. But if I go into my local host ports, let's see, 8088, 8088, forward dash API dash docs.json. I could be mistaken, and if I am, I'll have to owe this to you. But again, there is a there we go. So this is my Swagger specification for this particular virtual API that we have.
Not a very fancy one, but hey.
Right. So this is Swagger, and you can actually import this into any client like SOAP UI, and it'll automatically sub out all the methods that are built out in this virtual API. Really, really powerful. And if you guys want to take a quick look at that, because that's in my experience, it's really helpful, just so that you could start importing all of the basic endpoints that are available, without much hesitation. So Swagger definition. click on next, just following these nice step-by-step processes that we give you. We'll import all the services that are in there. So hopefully that makes sense. There's a couple of other questions in here. Another question about LDAP. Same answer there. You're going to have a handful of people deploying these virtual APIs and administrating them, right?
Right.
It's not 100 people that need to administer these virtual instances.
All right, so let's get going. We've got 15 minutes left, so
yeah. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we've covered a lot. So let's.
So now let's go ahead and just talk a little bit about virtualizing your end goal versus all the dependencies along the way. So it turns out that we run into this question often with our customers, sort of saying, well, what do I virtualize? Do I virtualize each of the APIs I access? So if I have an API that calls another API and calls another one downstream, what do I need to virtualize? And what we want to sure to share with you is that we recommend that you virtualize your initial connection, the first API, and that you incorporate the responses from all the downstream APIs into the responses that you would get back from that first API. So it's actually I think it confuses people because they have all of these APIs. They're, one API is calling another, and if you think about like a financial services application where, or even anything that does e-commerce, there's many downstream APIs till you get back that the credit card was accepted, right? And so people always are wondering, do I have to virtualize each of those steps along the way? And what we want to say is that if you're really thinking about virtualizing, don't do that. Just virtualize that one interface and pick up all the responses that you would need to simulate as a result of those downstream APIs.
Right. So in this case, less is more. You can bulk all that into one virtual instance, and then you could string them together however you like or however you need to use some of the out-of-the-box functionalities that we have. A lot of users sometimes, think of this as a bigger instance where in practice, it's much simpler than what it may seem.
Right. Exactly. So the other thing is that back to how many verts do I need and actions versus an operation, and basically, if you go back to ServiceV and look at it, we have them there. It's called a Vert action.
Right, so Vert action are the actual expectations of the incoming requests. Okay,
right.
and these will differ depending on you virtualizing a SOAP service versus virtualizing a RESTful service. RESTful services have Vert action, which inherently will be an HTTP method, right? Get, post, put, deletes. These are the ones that we imported from the Swire definition, whereas if you have a SOAP service, and I'm hoping I have one here, you will have an operation versus an action. It's just, different naming conventions because of the two different protocols, but they're very, they go hand in hand. The Vert operations do require an initial whistle definition, though, to go off of for the structure. So those are the differences between both. Again, if anybody's confused by it, anybody has any questions about it, please feel free to let me know.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you. And then, so from a tips and tricks perspective, we talked about this, but how you can create a functional test using SOAP UI. And right within the test, you can start up your virtualized service and go ahead and run against the virtualized service. Along with that, we have the runner capability,
Right.
and I don't know if you want to show it. It's not very exciting to look at. But
so the runner capability is super interesting because if you're trying to run tests against virtual APIs as part of an automated process because a particular API is not available, for example. You want a simple way where you could stand up a virtual API and deploy it in a particular Vert server, for example. And that can all be done via our runners. Everything is manipulated by the command line, and we also provide a Jenkins plugin for these runners so that you can actually, manipulate it from Jenkins. And I think the best example we could show is from Jenkins if I have it running.
That's right there. Yeah.
89, I think. Let's see. Yep. So I already have something set up over here with the Verts Server configuration, and the plugin is actually pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Once you install it, you could add a build action within a job process that will either deploy a specific virtual API, that will add a virtual API that would stop it, right? Because obviously you don't want resources to be consumed if it's not actually being used. So you could have a post-build action that stops it, a pre-build action that starts it up, and in the middle you have your tests, being executed against your virtual APIs and your APIs as an integrated process.
Yeah, and the deploy and the undeploy is moving the services to the Vert server. So you have to have that virtualized service on the Vert server, and then you can start it and stop it, and you can undeploy it. Right. So all of the things that you could do on the Vert server are available within the plugins. All right, and cloning virtual API responses. So actually, that's one of the things that people do a lot, especially with our JDBC support. So the idea is that you might create, you might actually go ahead and do recording to get your responses from the live API or the live system. Sorry, not the live API, the live system. And so you go ahead and you do recording of all the responses, and then you might want to change some or edit them and configure them differently or set up extreme parameters or put all sorts of things in them. So basically what Tamil is showing you here is how easy it is to just copy a response, and then you can go ahead and make copies of copies of copies, and you can go ahead and make quick edits to it, and you can add your Vert responses really, really quickly. It makes it really simple to build up a virtualized API really.
Right. So in my experience, some competitors don't have these capabilities of easily manipulating these responses. You record, captured all your recordings, and then if you want to update or change one little piece, you'll have to re-record the whole thing again. We give you the capability of recording, capturing what you need, and altering anything within that captured API responses. So you have no limitation there, and we add to that by giving you this copy capability, which again, if you have 100 pets that you should have in your backend, then why have to do that manually? Copy it and respond it. We also have capabilities to pull that data from external sources like Excel, databases, and a couple of others.
Right.
And I do want to mention, we focus a lot on REST and SOAP, but we do virtualize a couple of other protocols, including JMS and databases. Okay, so these are definitely really powerful entities.
And very popular.
Very popular.
Actually, very popular.
The functionality is very similar, though. Everything that you see today can be applied to virtualizing a database or a JMS endpoint.
Okay. Saving the transaction log.
So saving the transaction log should be pretty simple. It's just a click of a button, and I'll just show you from the Vert server standpoint. Once you have something available, you can export it by. You can also limit the amount of transactions that you can have, again, to save resources. But these can be exported pretty simply by downloading the option right there. Okay.
Okay. And click a second. Yeah. Right. And we talked about recording for requests and routing for responses. Okay. So yeah, we talked about recording. So basically, a great way, is to sort of set it up, do a bunch of recording, and then shut it down, shut down the recording, and now you have your responses, and you can just route to those to get to simulate the real responses.
Right. So that's again is we do a couple of different ways, right? Let's say that the virtual API is already built out, or you know, in any case, maybe it's not, but we do have two ways that you can do it. First one being right from when you start, you can record the transactions and navigate over to the interface of a front end, capture the backend API calls. In this case, I'm just going to capture one really quick, so that you could go on with the last slide. So I've captured information from the real Google Maps API, and I could say create new Vert off of this. Google Maps. Okay. So I've captured one response, and that's what's in here. It's information about Bossa, but maybe, you know, in the future I need to start capturing more. So I can actually say route to Google Maps, and I want to say route everything. You can conditionally route. So if, for example, you have X value in the request, you may or may not want to route. So you could decide that conditionally with a conditional option. For the sake of this demo, I'll say all, and I'll capture routed responses. And just, you know, like earlier, I do need an interface to interact with this virtual API. This time, instead of using SOAP UI, let's go ahead and use something else. Let's use a browser. So let's say 8083 start, and now I could say, all right, let's pull up my browser. I could say localhost ports 8083 / all of that fun stuff, and then address equals Florida, and sensor equals false. Enter. Yes, leave page. If this works correctly, I should be able to, again, interact with my virtual service over here. Let's make sure everything's right. Local host port 8083 forward dash. Oh, I see what's wrong. There's an extra dash in there. There we go. So I'm actually getting Florida, and if you take a look behind the scenes, we get Florida there. Let's do one more. Let's sample, say New York, Gil's favorite place in the world. We get New York, and we've captured that. Now that I have those in-house, I can stop routing. I no longer need to use this routing capability, and I can actually instantiate those responses from my local environment. Okay, so if I hit it, although I'm not routing anymore, I should still get New York. And if I say Florida, I will get back Florida. So we also capture the actual logic that you captured, that you received it in. So really, really powerful.
Yep. Cool.
All right, guys. So we have about a minute left here.
Yep.
Right on the mark. So let's go ahead and finish off with.
Yeah, we had basically put in a bunch of the, if there are any questions, what we had done in their most recent releases. We actually had a 2.1 release, but it just sort of, we've been enhancing this significantly release after release. There's the web UI for managing the Verts Server, a dashboard capability that's in Ready API that shows you what's going on with the ServiceV, the virtualized services, and a number of things. But the point of this is really just to say that this is one of our key offerings, and we're continuing to use customer feedback to build on it and enhance it and add more systems that we can virtualize and things like that. So if you're not seeing something that you would like, we'd love to know more about it. And with that, we have any questions? We have, again, pretty quiet. I think the most exciting was logging into the Vert server.
I'd say routing was the most exciting.
I actually think routing is the most exciting. I agree with you, but.
All right, guys. So again, if questions come up later on, we're always available. We definitely, reach out to us, send us your questions, send us your comments. We're more than happy to help out or, provide feedback about your environments and whatnot.
Yep, I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody,
Next.
for attending today. Hopefully you have a great long weekend.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Thanks, Gail and Camille, for presenting. We'll see you next time.